first video this way with a real person instead of just words all the time. And this is the video about declaring independence, and it really has four parts. The first thing I'm going to get into is the question of how did this thing called common sense, how did common sense change many colonists' minds? And what you need to know is that the writer of Common Sense was a man named Thomas Paine, P-A-I-N-E. And he was actually an Englishman himself. He'd come over to the colonies in 1774. He was kind of a failure at a bunch of different kinds of things. His family had made corsets, which were a kind of special sort of undergarment for women. He basically made underwear. But he had also been paying a lot of attention to what was going on with government. He was that kind of guy who could really persuade people to do things a lot. And when he came over here, and after he'd been hearing and thinking a lot about what's going on, about Lexington and Concord and all the acts that had led up before, these intolerable acts, in January 1776, he writes a book, a little booklet really, called Common Sense. And basically his point was, hey colonists, you should just bust away from this mother country. And one of his reasons is how absurd it is for these colonies to be ruled by an island that is so far away. He says it's common sense that you should want to break away from this mother country. He talks about the king, King George III, a lot, and just kings in general. He says kings aren't doing God's will. They're not some special person who deserves to be better and more powerful than anyone else. He says actually, monarchs, kings are corrupt. He calls King George a royal brute, which is not a nice thing to say at all. And another reason he has is that there's no real economic reason to stay. He points out about all the boycotts that the colonists had done, going back to the Stamp Act of 1765. His point is there's no economic reason to stay. You've got enough stuff here on this continent. You can be your own kind of country. And this idea just takes off. It is an instant success. This book sells tons and tons of copies. He doesn't get all that rich from it, but he definitely gets to be famous from selling this little booklet called Common Sense. So it changes the minds of a lot of colonists who weren't quite sure about whether independence made sense or not. His book, Common Sense, says of course it does. It makes a lot of sense. Now you might be wondering, the second thing is, why didn't all American colonists already want independence? You may have been thinking that about the 1760s and the road to revolution. Didn't all the colonists already want to be independent? Weren't they thinking of this all along? And the answer really is no. Many of them were not. Historians basically have divided up into three based on not polls. They didn't do kind of surveys back then like we have nowadays. They couldn't just put a Facebook poll out there for people. But basically from looking at resources, most historians believe there were basically three equal groups. There was a group of patriots, we call them, and they call themselves the rebels, the ones who are ready to go to independence, go to war if it requires that. There's another group that we call Loyalists. We capitalize the L. Loyalists, they were the people who were much more loyal to the king, and I'll get back to them in a second. And then there's about a third group who are kind of in between. They're neutral, they don't really maybe care very much about what goes on. Think maybe some backcountry settlers who don't really get involved much with England's business. Or people who just want to stay out of work completely and aren't really picking sides. So you have patriots, you have folks in the middle, and you have loyalists. Again, you might be wondering, why would anyone be loyal to England after all the things that have happened? Well, actually England has had, even before the 1700s, had a history of being perhaps the freest, the most democratic kind of government and country in the world, or at least in Europe. The English were very proud of that. And it goes all the way back to the year 1215, 500 years, way more than 500 years before the Revolution. Something called the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta had been passed by King John. And basically what this did was it gave the nobles, gave the non-royal families some more rights. The king couldn't put any tax on them that he wanted to. In fact, there was going to be a group that would get together and would work with the king to make any laws. And that group came to be known as Parliament. Of course, in the 1760s, we think of Parliament as the bad guys. But in the 1200s, this was a pretty new kind of idea. And a lot more things in English history have given the English people this idea that they have rights, that they're a special kind of people compared to the rest of Europe. In the 1600s, in 1688, after a period of civil war, which I won't get into, but England had a nasty time in the 1600s. Civil war, one of the kings got his head chopped off. In 1688, there was a Bill of Rights. You may have heard of the American Bill of Rights, but the first one was the English Bill of Rights, and it gave a lot of rights to the people. The king and the queen gave away some of their power, and some of those rights are people can have weapons. The government can't take your weapons away. Another right is you can have a trial from a jury, not just a single judge. You can have a public trial. There would be no cruel punishments, no unusual punishments. And maybe those are some rights that you've heard of before in our country. So there was this history in England. So if you're a loyalist, you might be thinking, well, we've had a tough time with English government before, and it's ended up working out pretty well for us. It worked out well in 1215. It worked out well in the 1600s eventually, after people stopped getting their heads cut off. So maybe it can work well again. So that's basically the idea of how the English were maybe thinking that things might turn out all right, especially some colonists were thinking things might turn out all right. So going ahead to 1776, you have this Declaration of Independence, and we'll get into more of that in a moment. Basically, what you should know about it is that it's based on this idea of natural rights. Actually, in the document, they're called inalienable rights, which is kind of odd to have the word alien in there. But basically, these are natural rights. And this whole idea comes from a man named John Locke, L-O-C-K with an E on the end. He had actually passed away in 1714, so he's not alive at the time of the Revolution. But John Locke had written a number of books. They're really hard to get through. There's a philosophical kinds of books. But here's basically his idea about natural rights. He had this amazing idea for the time that people are born with rights. That from the moment of birth, you're born with human rights. Again, this is something we probably just all accept now. But this was kind of a new idea back then. You're born with rights, whether you're rich or poor, whether your family is whatever color of your skin even, you're born with rights. Some of these rights that he focused on are the right to life, nobody can kill you, right to liberties, you have freedoms that you can have, and property. Your property is your own property. Those were his big three: life, liberty, and property. But then he went on to say about government. He said that government's job is to protect those rights. Again, this is a new kind of idea. This isn't saying that government is meant to control the people, which was basically the idea before. John Locke is saying that you have natural rights, and it's the government's job to protect those rights: your life, your liberty, and your property. And then he goes another step further. He says, if the government's not doing those things, then the people who are born with those rights, they have the liberty, they have the freedom to get rid of that government and replace it. Now remember, when he's writing this around the year 1700 or so. In England, they'd had a civil war, they'd had a Bill of Rights. They'd kind of already done this before, but never anything quite so official as declaring total independence. Again, England in the 1600s stayed together just with a better, they hoped, better kind of government. John Locke is saying, if that government's still not doing what it's supposed to do, you have the natural rights to kick them out and start something new. So that's where we get to the Declaration of Independence. Now, putting all this together, you may be wondering, why didn't this Continental Congress declare independence earlier than they did? The Continental Congress, you might remember, they started getting together right around the time of Lexington and Concord, right after the battles of Lexington and Concord. We had the Second Continental Congress. The first one was sorting out boycotts and saying, maybe we should set up a militia. By the Second Continental Congress, which you have most of the same guys all meeting together in Pennsylvania, now the issue is, what are we going to do about this? Setting up an army. But why didn't they declare independence earlier than July 4th, 1776? Well, given some hints before, is that not everybody was a patriot. Not everybody was eager to do this rebellion. In fact, some members of that Congress were in that neutral group, and a couple were even more like Loyalists. They were trying to figure out, let's make this work. Again, think of the olive branch petition that came out of that Congress. If they'd all been patriots, then they probably wouldn't have bothered with that olive branch petition. So why didn't they declare independence? Some of the members wouldn't vote for declaring independence right away. They're trying to make this work. And they're thinking about things in their history of England, why it might actually work out. Here's another reason, is that being in the Continental Congress was already really dangerous to do. It was going against what the king and parliament had wanted. So already they're in trouble. If the army comes along and catches them, they might get put into prison. But if they declare independence, that's true treason, and they would be punished by death, and they know this. So they've got to take this really seriously before they sign their name to this piece of paper saying, yep, I'm the one who wanted this. If you find me, you're probably going to kill me. So for their own personal safety, they're going to take some time to think this through. And then there are questions. What kind of government is going to replace this English government? We've never had more than a colony kind of government before with each 13 of the 13 colonies. What kind of government would we have? Right now we're just a bunch of guys meeting together. What kind of government would we really have? That's a big question. What about the economy? Remember, their one trading partner was England. They've been trading back and forth across the ocean. They've stopped a lot of that trading as part of the boycotts, and things haven't actually been going all that well. France is really far away. Did they want to trade with the French? Remember, they just went to war with France not too long earlier. Their options are really kind of limited. And military, right? They don't have any of their own things. They haven't had any manufactured goods except what England brought to them. So if they declare political independence, if they declare their government is independent, what about their economy? How are they going to get the things that they need? These are the kinds of questions that they are considering. But in June of 1776, a Virginian in the Congress, a Virginian man named Richard Henry Lee, a name you might not have heard of before, but he's the one who first steps up and says, I'm going to put down this piece of paper here saying that we should declare independence. Will anyone sign it with me? Well, they talk about it a bit. They decide we need something that's a bit more official than this. So they set up a committee with names like Benjamin Franklin. John Adams is on that committee. A man named Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston. These are guys from different colonies, not just one colony, but up and down. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, you have Thomas Jefferson, this guy who not many people had really heard of. He'd written a couple things that some folks knew. And like often happens with group projects, as you might have noticed, usually one person gets kind of stuck with all the work, and that's Thomas Jefferson. He gets stuck with most of the writing. He's that kind of quiet sort of guy. He's okay to take it on. He takes it home, works on it for a couple of weeks, brings it up to the guys. Hey, what do you think of what I've written? They change some typos, they cross out a couple of things, but basically they say, hey, good job, and they all go in and get credit together. Although really, as you probably know, Thomas Jefferson gets the most credit, as he probably should. So he brings it in. July 2nd, the whole group votes and approves it. It's July 4th that they all sign it and announce it. That's why July 4th is the famous day for us today. Although John Adams actually wrote home to his wife Abigail on July 2nd and said, July 2nd will be a national holiday, will be known forever, but not really announced July 4th. But, and here's the last thing for this video, the United States, as they call themselves, were not really independent yet. They've declared independence, but they're not really independent until basically England agrees. And that's what's going to take a war, and that's one thing we're going to focus on in a later set of classes.